Okay, so I want to just give a little bit of the backstory on these great caterpillars that occur in eastern California in some of the desert habitats. And first start out by just sharing an image of what these moths look like. You gotta love them, they're so beautiful. They're this wonderful green color, and because of that, they're called emerald moths. And these moths belong to the family that we call the Geometridae, which are all of the inchworm caterpillar moths, a really diverse family all over the world, and quite a few species in the United States. And every habitat has some really great species to find. So this is one of the Nemoria species, that's the genus, and this one is one that we reared in our lab from eggs that were collected out in New Mexico. This is called Nemoria caerulescens, and you can see the two white lines on the wings and then the little white spots on the abdomen. It's just sort of a really beautiful example of the genus in the Southwest and some of the species that occur there. And there's quite a diversity in the Southwest in California, probably about 10 to 15 different species in this genus. And like I said, the caterpillars in this family are inchworm caterpillars, and this is one of the really famous images of one of the great polyphenisms, one of the different developmental paths that these caterpillars can take. And this is a Nemoria in Arizona called Nemoria arizonaria. And what you see is a caterpillar on the left that's a catkin feeder. It's feeding on the flowers, the catkins of oak in the springtime, and it develops into a catkin mimic. You can see that golden brown bumpy form of the caterpillar. But if the larvae are fed leaves or they're feeding on leaves, they take a different developmental path and they develop into a sort of soft gray twig mimic that's much smoother and has a completely different morphology. And we see this kind of polyphenism show up in quite a number of the species in this group, and it's just a really interesting aspect of how these larvae have adapted to be more effectively camouflaged on their substrate. Here's another Nemoria larva from New Mexico. This is called Nemoria obliqua, and this is a specialist on sumac. And here it's sort of perched at the end of a twig with the buds of Rhus, the sumac, this one being the skunk bush sumac or Rhus trilobata. And one of the things that distinguishes most of the Nemoria caterpillars are they have these fairly significant lateral protuberances that stick out from the middle segments. They have sort of these extended fan-like aspects in the body that stick out in the middle and really make them quite distinct from most of the other inchworms, which tend to be little smooth cylindrical caterpillars. But these are some of the most dramatically sort of specialized caterpillars in the family, and they really stand out in that way. And this is one of our common eastern, mid-Atlantic, and southeastern Nemoria, and you can really get a look at those lateral protuberances on the abdominal segments of the caterpillar. This is called Nemoria lixaria, and these three different larvae were reared out of the same clutch of eggs, but they fed on birch at the top and maple in the middle and oak on the bottom. And the differences are very subtle, but there are some differences in the coloration in these, but really it's a great way to just get a look at the general anatomy of what these sort of typical Nemoria caterpillars look like when they fall off of a leaf or a branch, or when you're rearing them in a container. And you can see they're really quite dramatic in the development of those extensions off of the sides. This is another one of the eastern species of Nemoria. This is Nemoria satiriba from the Carolinas and on down into Florida. And you can see that each of these Nemoria caterpillars has some really distinct markings that in many cases allow one to distinguish the species on the basis of the coloration or the morphology of the caterpillar. So the species can look really similar as adults as the green moths, but sometimes the larvae are really good distinguishing larvae that allow one to recognize the differences between species because they may feed on different host plants and they may have really different looking structures and coloration. This is another southwestern species. This one is Nemoria festaria from Arizona, And again, you can see a pretty significant difference here. This is a polyphagous species that eats quite a few different plants and is found on a lot of different things. And the top caterpillar has been feeding on oak catkins, and you can see it's got that brown gold color. And the bottom one was feeding on leaves of sumac, and that one ended up being a lot smoother and also have a lot of green, much lighter in color with a lot of green in the integument. These two larval images come from a Nemoria species that we've worked with in the east. This is a specialist on cypress in the bald cypress swamps that you find all along the southeast coast from Maryland down through the Carolinas and then across the Gulf Coast and into Texas. And this is called Nemoria alpha. But what's really neat here is that the larva on the left is a larva that fed on very young cypress needles in the spring. And as a spring feeding larva, it's adopted the green coloration of the needles and is really being a needle mimic. The bald cypress, as a gymnosperm, is one of the deciduous conifers, so it loses all of its needles late in the fall and ends up being just bare branches and twigs through the winter. And so the larva on the right is actually a larva that fed on mature needles later in the season, and there seems to be something that allows it to detect the maturity of the needles and a sense of seasonally where it is. So it has adopted a twig mimic coloration that gives it a bumpier appearance. It actually has developed a lot of mid-dorsal protuberances and much more of a gray-brown color that allows it to look a lot more like the sticks of the cypress tree rather than needle mimic that you see earlier on in the season. And this just gives you another idea of the variability in the coloration of these larvae. This is from up in the northeast, up in Maine, and Mike Canfield collected all three of these Nemoria larvae. They're Nemoria rubrifrontaria, which is a species that often feeds on sweet fern in the Miraceae, and here at the same time in the same general area from plants he was beating, he found three really different color morphs, and so quite a bit of variability even at the same time and the same season at one location. So I want to say a little more about the specifics of the work that we've been doing in our lab in the last 2 years. We've been working on trying to delimit or distinguish these two species that you see here. These are both Nemoria species, and they're named as different species. On the left is a Nemoria called intensaria, and Nemoria intensaria is best known from Nevada, from Utah, where the type locality is, and from Eastern California, but it also shows up down into West Texas. On the right is Nemoria cerulescens, which is really well known from New Mexico, and they have a few really subtle differences in their markings, particularly on the abdomen and on the color of the legs and on the wing fringes, but they're very similar in many respects and they're hard to distinguish. And most of the major natural history museum collections have a lot of drawers that are mixed up. It's hard to tell these apart, and even the really characteristic internal anatomy of the genitalic structures, which usually can reliably distinguish species that look outwardly similar. In this case, those genitalic structures are also almost identical and practically indistinguishable. So we are looking for ways to define and delimit these species more clearly by looking at both molecular evidence from the mitochondrial DNA sequences, but also by trying to get a really good look at the larval stages and the host plant records and what the caterpillars look like. So we're interested in the form of the larvae, but also really interested in the ecology and the behavior of the moths, both in the larval stages and then the seasonality of the different adult broods. This is a map that shows some of the site records for these two species from museum collections at the Smithsonian and the American Museum of Natural History in New York and the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. And while this is not every locality where they've been collected, this gives a sense of the range of these two. Nemoria cerulescens, the blue squares, really is best known from New Mexico, but also from southeastern Arizona and up into the Rockies in Colorado. and then occurs in the Guadalupe Mountains and the Davis Mountains of West Texas. Nemoria intensaria in that form is much better known from the Great Basin, from Utah, northern Arizona, from Clark County, Nevada, outside Las Vegas, and then from quite a few localities in eastern California. But Nemoria intensaria also shows up in West Texas, and that's the place where the two are the most confounded and confused, but it gives you a sense of the geographic range of these two species. So there are a couple of different ways we can study caterpillars, and the first is to collect adult female moths and get them to lay eggs and have those eggs hatch and rear them out. But the second way, which gives us a lot more information about the larvae and their host plants, is to go into the field and to look for these caterpillars with a beating sheet and to bring that beating sheet out underneath plants, wrap them really hard with a stick or a pole, and to see what falls off different plants, and then see the particular developmental stage of the larvae at different moments in the season, and actually have a clear association of the larva with a particular species. So this is just an image of someone out in that fabulous habitat with a beating sheet, looking at what's dropped off of a plant and sort of sorting through the things that are there on the sheet. And here you can watch Dave Wagner. Dave Wagner at the University of Connecticut has done a tremendous amount of work on Lepidopteran larvae, butterflies, and moths, and he is currently writing a field guide to the western caterpillars of the moths of the west. And here he is in Texas doing some beating, and you'll see here how he wraps the branches really rapidly and causes things that are feeding on it to drop down into that beating sheet. This is what geometrid larva looks like once it's fallen onto the sheet. This is not a Nemoria. This is an unidentified little cylindrical inchworm. They can be really small. In fact, sometimes when a lot of plant debris falls off, you really have to look closely to be able to pick out the caterpillars from any other bits of twigs or leaves that have fallen off. Remember, these are larvae that have evolved to be as well camouflaged as they can and to really be cryptic. So when the material falls in the beating sheet, it takes some really close inspection. And sometimes if we blow lightly across the beating sheet or tip it up, a lot of the real plant debris and the dead leaf matter and twigs will fall off, and the larvae, if they've been given a moment, often have attached themselves a little bit by their prolegs and are hanging onto the sheet, so they tend to stick and kind of hang on while a lot of the plant material will blow away. It takes a moment for them to get a grip, but often they'll be hanging on there and the plant things will just slide right away. This image is mostly just to point out that when these larvae first hatch, they are really tiny. They're, I like to say, about the size of an eyelash. These are some Nemoria tuscarora larvae on a hypericum leaf, and they are minute. And if this is the stage when the larvae have just hatched, when you're out beating, it can be really tough to pick them out because they are so very, very small. But there are more of them. As the larvae go through their different instars, and Nemoria typically have 5 molts, so they have a variety of different larval stages between their shedding their skins. As they move through those stages, they also are getting picked off by predators, particularly birds, but also they're being parasitized. There are a number of different parasitic flies and wasps that will lay their eggs on these caterpillars, and then many of them either never make it to the pupal stage, or they might pupate, and then the pupa never actually ecloses as an adult, but rather the parasitic fly, like a tachinid fly, will emerge right out of the pupa. This is a really good look of what a Nemoria larva looks like when it's fallen off of a plant and lying on its side. This is Nemoria bistriaria in the east, and sort of knocked off of oak and sort of lying on its side on an oak leaf. All this kind of a nice close picture. It's a bit smaller than it looks there, but again you can see how distinctive the form of that caterpillar is with those flanges that are coming off of the side, and its kind of gray-brown coloration. When we've collected caterpillars, we like to bring a little bit of the host plant into the lab, and we just use Gladware containers or Tupperware containers and a little sprig of the host plant, sometimes stuck into a little tube of water and sometimes just sort of resting in there in the open, and let them feed. and watch them develop, and we try to photograph them at different stages, but also try to get some data on how long they take to mature, watch for the different instars to develop as they shed their skin and move from one instar to the next, and then finally pupate, and then see how long they stay in the pupa stage before they emerge as an adult. And we have the adults eclose right in those containers, and so after they pupate, we leave them in the containers, and the adults will come out usually after anywhere from 10 days to 2 weeks, and if they're not in diapause, they'll pop right back out, and then these beautiful green moths will be on the wall or the lid of the container. This is what the pupa looks like. This is actually the pupal stage of Nemoria pulcherrima, another California species of Nemoria, and you can see the wing cases there, and sometimes this is the stage in which these moths spend the winter. They might overwinter as a pupa in the leaf litter underneath the host plant, and in that case they go into a diapause, and they might remain in this stage for 6 to 8 months. In other cases, they have continuous generations, 1, 2, 3, or more, and this stage is short-lived, and they only are in this stage, as I said, for just a week to 2 weeks before they emerge as an adult, and then flying and mating again to lay another batch of eggs and continue the next brood. So that's sort of the backstory to the interest we have in these caterpillars, and some of the other stories that go along with a number of these species. And I'm really excited about what we might find in California there around Deep Springs, and whether or not this Nemoria intensaria might be feeding on Persia or Aragonum or one of the other species that's right there around Deep Springs. And it would be great to get a chance to find out what kind of host plant records might come out of looking at those plants with a beating sheet, and also a little bit about what stages the larvae are in different weeks of the year, and also perhaps a little bit of a sense of the density of whether these are common or uncommon or incredibly rare. But I know there's a population of that Nemoria right there, and it'd be great to get a chance to find out a little bit more about the ecology of that species in that particular location, and see how that compares to some of the other places where these two Nemoria species show up.